Hi, hello everybody. My name is Francisco. Today I'll be presenting the book The Politics of Military Rule in Brazil, 1964 to 1985. The author of this book is Thomas SKidmore. So let's begin with the presentation with an overview of what I'm gonna talk about in this presentation. In this presentation, I'm gonna first start with talking about the author of the book. Then I'm gonna move to following more or less the same the direction of the book. I'm gonna talk about the events, a little bit about the events before the coup in 1964. Then we're gonna move to the discussion that the author had between describing the years of the 2 decades of the military regime, 1964 to 1985. I'm gonna mention briefly the ideas of Guillermo Donne, because I just think relates so much with what Professor Skidmore wrote in his book. After that brief comments on Guillermo Donne, I'll move towards the end with the democratization and how the author described the process in the book. Okay, so let's begin with the author. The author is Thomas SKidmore. We have read about him before. We have read books by him before. He was an historian. He obtained his PhD in Harvard University in 1960. He then moved to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he was the editor of the Luso-Brazilian Review. He was an historian mainly focused on Latin America, with a particular focus on Brazil. He even tried to go to Brazil several times, but it was denied his visa to go there during the military regime. It wasn't until towards the end of the military regime in the mid-80s, where he was able to go there. However, after several comments that he made, he was summoned to the federal police. Things happen during military regimes. He has several important books. For example, Brazil, 5 Centuries of Change, the one about modern Latin America. The style, I wanted to talk about a bit of the style of the book, because I found the style very interesting. I mean, the book is, of course, very well written. It's really easy to read. Because I don't know, in my opinion, sometimes feels like a biography of an authoritarian regime. Not only the authoritarian regime, but also the books give you like the currents. You can the author give you the undercurrents of what was happening in Brazil during the military regime, and the economic side and the political side of what happened before and what happened after and during the military regime. So also, I thought it was a nice addition when the author include personal backgrounds, academic backgrounds of the heads of governments during the military regime. That gave you, at least for me, that gave me like a really interesting idea of who they were. I don't know. It was positive to know who they were. Why they. In the case, for example, of Castelo Branco, it's really interesting. You, after knowing who he was and where he studied, you can know why he chose to do what he did and why he was a moderate, in contrast with Medici, who was a more a hardliner during the military regime. Okay, so let's start with a conceptualization of what was Brazil before the coup. So the 60s were a difficult decade for most of Latin America. The Cuban Revolution made a huge impact in the region. Elites in all countries were preoccupied and were scared that a communist takeover would be coming soon. More or less, very similar to what happened during the Haitian Revolution, before the independence in Latin America. So, of course, in Brazil, that gust of the communist takeover was very present. And both President Quadros and Goulart, they didn't try to hide their sympathies toward the Cuban Revolution and towards socialist ideas. They didn't try to hide them. That gave voice to more they gave ideas to the military mainly, who didn't see, and the authors said it clearly, the military didn't see that the political opposition was had a voice to be able to overturn the country. The military didn't see that the political opposition, has the instruments and the political mobilization to create a viable alternative to the party in power. Thus, they decided to take the political change in their hands. Also, there was an economic situation going on. Brazil had experienced incredible change, an incredible growth since the 1940s, and a massive industrialization took over with Juscelino Kubitschek, and the growth and the development of Brazil was a symbol that maybe Brazil was about to take off, but inflation was mounting and the inequalities persisted between the rural and the cities, between the north and the south. Basic infrastructure, the author described, was in really bad shape. Electric power wasn't enough not even to meet basic demand in the bigger cities like Rio or Sao Paulo. It wasn't the idyllic place that was described by that people believe that could be Brazil. So that's the context that the authors describe before the 1964 coup. So yes, so it was, as the author said, the relative weakness of the civilian anti-Goulart forces that led top-level officers to conclude that the only intervention could save Brazil. Meaning that only the military could move themselves to protect Brazil. So when the military, as the author described, that when the military arrived to power, their first intention was, number one, to stabilize the economy, and number two, to protect Brazil from any communist takeover. That was kind of what Castelo Branco, the first military leader, was aspiring to. In the book, it describes how Castelo Branco thought that only the revolution, the military coup, would only last for 3 years, and that would be enough to put the economy again in good shape, and to eliminate any communist threat. However, it wasn't possible. Castelo Branco even, it wasn't possible. So after the 3 years of Castelo Branco, Costa Silva took over the military regime as a consensus replacement for Castelo Branco. Costa Silva had a very different personality. Even Castelo Branco, on the one hand, he has a very stoic personality. Also, on the other hand, Costa Silva has a more maybe Caudillo-like personality. He was more able to connect with people. his idea was to humanize the revolution. Again, he wanted to give back freedoms to Brazilians. But as the author says, the situation in the country didn't allow him to do it. On the political front, the pressure of the guerrilla movement was mounting in the streets. Although the guerrilla movement wasn't successful, that was the reasoning behind the start of the tortures and the increase of the levels of repression towards civil society in Brazil. And on the other hand, the economy was starting to move toward positive signs. Thus, Costa Silva, in order to keep the economic movement and to reduce the likeliness of the guerrilla continuing to gain power, issued the Institutional Act Number 5, which basically stopped the political process, take away the rights, the political rights of the Brazilian. They also allow torture, and legalize all the extrajudicial processes that were taking place in Brazil. Well, after Costa Silva, we have the General Medici term. General Medici term was marked by two things. Well, actually three. Let's say three. The first one was the so-called economic miracle. After the Costa Silva government, the bases were placed for Brazil to experience tremendous growth, and in fact, this growth was concentrated in the cities, for the middle classes in the city, who actually experienced an increase of the living standards during Medici. However, at the same time, Medici increased exponentially the repression towards the civil society and politicians. This term of Medici was marked also by Medici's utilization of football, soccer, to promote Brazilian image in the world, but also within his own image within Brazil, which legitimized would help to legitimize the regime internally. At the end of the Medici's term, General Geisel took over the regime. He was elected the new head of government by Congress, and of course controlled by the military. And he proposed a different. He proposed an openness of the regime. He now decided that it was time to relax the political barriers that were hoisted by his predecessor, and he enacted this policy of distanciao to openness of the country. So he started to relax the political controls, which developed into a new constitution once the new head of state was elected, General Figueiredo. With him, he was the last of the military presidents during those 21 years. It's important to highlight, and the author also do it, the importance of the labor movement, especially in Sao Paulo. The metallurgic labor movement was critical to pressure the government and to relax the the political limits and repression. So, just wanted to mention 2 points about bureaucratic authoritarianism. If it's true that the author doesn't mention it, I just found interesting how this book relates to this idea by Guillermo O'Donnell. Well, more than idea, this is a theory. Guillermo O'Donnell was a political scientist from Argentina. He studied democracies and dictatorships in Latin America. He became famous because he developed this idea of bureaucratic authoritarianism. So in a few words, bureaucratic authoritarianism means that unlike previous experiences in Latin America during before the 60s, during the 70s, most of the military regimes in the region, mainly the southern con, those military regimes weren't led by caudillos. They were led by consensus among military officers and a group of officers. Even though they most of the time they only have one person in charge, behind that person there was always a coalition of military groups, business elites, technocrats, and other groups who trying to quote unquote modernize the state and the economy. So and I think I wanted to bring this up because I think that the Brazilian experience is one, if not the perfect example of this situation. The book is very clear on that, how it wasn't the military alone. It wasn't military in a coalition with other sectors of the society, civil society, and also international organizations in times that helped to consolidate and legitimize the regime within Brazil and abroad. So it's important to bring this up and see how political scientists saw this at this moment, saw these kind of regimes at this moment. So although there was always a person as the face of the regime was representing a more not coalition, but a more a wider coalition of different interests. So just as I was saying before, this is just a picture of the concentration claiming for free elections, free, universal, and direct elections for president. This was very common in the last years of the dictatorship in Brazil. So the books ends with a call with a call to understand the new chapter of Brazilian history, this new democracy that was forming in the late 80s. Of course, the author was keen to highlight some challenges that this new democracy was facing. First was the political challenge. The face of the democratization, Tancredo Neves, sadly died before he was able to assume the presidency. So, of course, when the vice president assumed as president, there were challengers especially from the military, and José Sarney was able to consolidate his power as the president, but of course it was challenging. It wasn't easy for the elected by president to assume then as president. On the economic front, challenges were as big as when the military regime came into power, because inflation was again mounting in Brazil. The so-called economic miracle was showing its true faces and limits, as of who was benefiting for the miracle, the so-called economic miracle, and the consequences of this induced growth in the economy of Brazil. Sadly, another pressure of the new democracy was the issue of inequality. With truthfully speaking, has been the issue of Brazil since Brazil and many other countries in Latin America since the beginning since the independence. Actually, the issue of inequality throughout the years, even though Brazil has before we're talking about the 80s, but until the 80s, every time Brazil growth or the Brazilian economic growth, it wasn't accompanied by distribution of that wealth throughout the society. Lastly, I just wanted to highlight the picture that is there. Is a picture of a soccer team, the Corinthians. It's a Brazilian soccer team. I wanted to put that picture there because even though the author doesn't mention it, that team during the 80s, the late 80s, was a symbol of democracy. They created a movement called the Democracia Corintiana because they took a revolutionary approach on how to manage the soccer team, a professional soccer team in Brazil. They decided to become a symbol, an example for all Brazilians, and they took all their decisions by elections, by voting. They even won 2 Brazilian tournaments. Even like when the coach was doing substitutions during the game, it was chosen by election. The players who were to play in the game were chosen among the players by elections. So that was it's a very interesting example and situation in Brazil. Definitely it's another way to show how soccer and politics are always tied together in Brazil. Lastly, just wanna translate for you guys the poster they have in the picture. It says, "Winning or losing, but always with democracy." Just as a conclusion, the book is an excellent resource to study not only military regimes in Brazil, but military regimes in Latin America, and to understand what were the reasons behind the military regime and how it came to an end. Definitely a way to understand Brazil today is to understand this military regime and its consequences to Brazil. Really great book by Thomas SKidmore, very interesting and a brilliant book for understanding this era in the region. To end, I just wanna give you the 3 resources that I mentioned during the presentation. Well, I just wanna give you 3 resources that I found interesting. One is about it's a song that was censored during the regime in the 70s. It's called "A Pesar de Você" by Chico Buarque. It's based on Medici, so it's a song. It's a protest song against the military regime. Then the documentary "The Age of Democracy," very popular, and you can see it. Now I understand even more what the documentary is describing. Lastly, is a YouTube video done, a documentary by Boris Fausto, a Brazilian historian, with more details about this period in Brazil. Well, thank you for listening. Bye.